Welcome to the N2WS 4.1 release webinar. We're very grateful that you decided to join us today. I see a lot of familiar names in the Q&A, and just thank you so much for taking the time to sit with us and take a look at what we've been working on over the past few months in terms of upgrades and integrations for N2WS and AWS. So I'm Ezra, by the way. I am not going to be doing a lot of talking on this webinar. I'm on the marketing team here at N2W, and you all accepted the invite from me, so thank you so much for that. But I did want to introduce our speakers. We have our resident IT magician, and that's a trademark name for Sebastian, who is a principal solutions architect here at N2W and a real expert in backup and disaster recovery for workloads running on AWS. He's joined today by Mike Strassman, a partner solutions architect for AWS, who supports partners like N2W and other storage partners as we build new features and capabilities on AWS and announce them to our customers and prospects. So we really appreciate Mike taking the time out today. But for now, I'm going to turn you over into the very capable hands of Sebastian as he introduces N2WS version 4.1.
So first off, I'd like to introduce you to N2WS and to anyone who's never heard of us. So N2WS was founded in 2012, and version 1.0 was released exactly 1 decade ago. So we're not the new kids on the block by any means, and we've been polishing and developing N2WS Backup and Recovery since dinosaurs roamed the earth, digitally speaking. And what makes N2WS Backup and Recovery worth looking at? Well, N2WS Backup and Recovery was the first cloud-native backup and recovery solution, born in the cloud, for the cloud, using cloud-native technologies. And the technology was built from scratch. We didn't have any legacy code from 1995 like some other backup solutions. And we're extremely flexible, backup and recovery and archival storage. Perhaps you want to perform a backup every 60 seconds or once a day, or how about once an hour during business hours, and outside of that work window, we fall back on backups every 8 hours. And this flexibility does not sacrifice precision. So if you want your backups to kick in at 12:17, that's what's going to happen on the dot. And deployment couldn't be easier. The solution deploys via the AWS Marketplace as a pre-configured AMI, which means we're infrastructure as a service. And the big advantage here is you aren't reliable. And you're not limited to a service that's running somewhere in the cloud. And more importantly, you aren't sharing this with any other customer. It's yours. Only you have access to it, and the data never goes over the wire. And near zero RTO, well, recovery point objective, that's the duration of time, and a service level within which a business process must be restored after a disaster. Or simpler, it's the amount of time you have before your CTO is breathing down your neck. And all this is wrapped into a pretty UI which visualizes all of your backup and recovery endeavors. So the next part is, well, 3 crucial steps for optimal AWS protection with N2WS. This is really a life cycle and a level of adoption that we see with our customers quite a lot. So first you have step 1, protect. This is when we're being approached by, I need to perform backups. I want to recover these backups very quickly. And then I also want to have alerting and reporting. That's a need that's addressed very, very quickly. And then usually the next step is, well, what about turning off resources when they're not needed? And that's a big money saver as well. And probably even more importantly is what we call the recovery scenarios. Because being able to recover something, that's very good, but also having the ability to orchestrate this recovery so that you can recover an entire environment all at once. So if there's a massive outage, then it's really just a single mouse click and I can then recover my entire environment. And the last step, step 3, is when it usually happens. Okay, so now we have all of that covered. We're performing backups. I feel safe. I can recover them. I can orchestrate the recovery. But then how can I save money? So the data lifecycle management is for how long do you want to retain the data. And the very last silo that you see here, that very last column, is archiving the data to a low-cost storage tier. Because not all data needs to be available within seconds. That's that near zero RTO we were just talking about. Nobody's going to cry if you tell them, oh, the recovery of data from 2017, that's going to take 15 minutes instead of 5 seconds. So that's where it comes into play, that we also have the ability then to recover the data and to archive the data into a much cheaper storage tier. Then let's talk about the current capabilities of N2WS Backup and Recovery. So first off, I would always like to point out the granular recovery on instance, volume, and file and folder level. And later on, I'll also show you a little demo of the product itself, which will show you the file and folder level recovery. Because let's face it, disasters happen in all shapes and sizes. It doesn't have to be your entire environment, an entire server, an entire volume. Probably more often than not, that's going to be a certain file and folder. Can you recover that really important Excel sheet or that really important PowerPoint? And we can certainly do that as well, even though we're using cloud-native technologies, which is the snapshot capability. You're never going to give up that granularity to be able to recover certain files and folders. Resource control, we already touched on that. So that allows you to automate the entire process of turning off resources when they're not needed. So if you have development instances that really don't need to be running on weekends or after hours, well, this allows you to completely automate that process. Cost Explorer, well, that avoids that sticker shock that you might have at the end of the month when you didn't really keep track of how much backups are actually going to cost you, that storage. And the Cost Explorer is a running tally, which will tell you exactly at any moment in time, exactly how much your backups are costing you. The Extended Data Lifecycle Management, talking about cost of backups, is then also the ability to store the data in Amazon S3, Glacier, or Deep Archive Glacier when you want to retain the data for a really long time. The recovery scenarios, I mentioned that already, that allows you to orchestrate an entire failover, and the scheduling part that you're seeing here on the list. Well, this also allows us then to schedule recoveries, either complete recoveries or also dry runs, and generate reports on this. So if you have a regulatory compliance need that you need to perform DR drills, then the system will easily allow you to do that, and then send out the report so I can prove that I performed my DR drills. And the product also allows full cross-region, cross-account disaster recovery, which means, well, if I want to spin up my data in a different region, in a different geographical region, or in a completely different, completely unrelated AWS account, I do have that ability as well. And N2WS Backup and Recovery also allows you to schedule and manage Amazon S3 replication and sync of S3 buckets as well. So now, the reason why we all came together here is what's new in N2WS 4.1. The marketing speech here is bringing next-gen AWS Backup to the next level. And quite frankly, I actually completely agree with this one. So number 8, we do now have the data protection, enhanced resiliency and protection. I would say one of the big keywords I keep hearing is ransomware. And we already included secure DR capability in our product, which allows you to browse and to report on permissions that IAM users or roles have in the account. And if a rogue admin tries to sneak in permissions through a seldomly used user or role, then the product will alert you to that fact. Now, with 4.1, we also use immutable backups and S3 object lock, which then protects against accidental deletions as well as malicious attacks. I mean, the object lock is a really useful feature. If you want to retain the data for a certain amount of time, you can then do that. And even a root admin wouldn't be able to delete that data. And this is really the ultimate in peace of mind, because I can set a specific time frame where I want to make sure that the data cannot be tampered with. This is an absolute must-have if you have that regulatory compliance need, if you need to retain the data for a year, 3 years, 7 years, and you need to be able to prove that nobody has the ability to tamper with that data as well. Now, I think, Mike, you have an opinion on this as well. We had a chat about this earlier.
Yeah, I'm sorry, excuse me. Thanks, Sebastian. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. So, yeah, I was just thinking, S3 Object Lock is creating the capability, when you have regulatory requirements that require worm storage, or you want to add that additional layer of protection against changes or deletion. But the key thing here is that, when a partner like N2WS integrates that capability into their data protection solution, that's what provides the mechanism to leverage the feature. And I think that's really cool, right? That's the key. You kind of need both, right? The ability to set the lock is one thing, but having the control and to configure that as part of your data protection mechanism is what makes the solution usable for customers.
Yeah, I love that feature. And truth be told, it was a feature that a lot of customers have asked for. And as I mentioned, we've been around for quite some time, and I would say, gosh, 70% of the features that you see in our product, at one point or another, they were a twinkle in the eye of a customer, and we listened very closely to what people requested, just like AWS does. I mean, there's always new features coming out, new services, and since we started this call about 14 minutes ago, probably AWS has premiered 3 new services. But Object Lock is definitely something that is going to help you, especially to address that key buzzword ransomware. What happens if somebody does have the ability to get into the account?
Yeah, we definitely have a lot of customers asking about ransomware these days.
The next one is database backup. So this allows you now, 4.1 allows the backup of SAP HANA, which allows not only the backup of the database itself, but also orchestration of the recovery of the database. You're probably thinking, well, previously I was able to select SAP HANA instances. I mean, they're nothing other than EC2 instances, and back them up. But what you would be missing is, obviously, it's an in-memory database, and all of those transactions that are still in memory, you'd be missing those. So the way this works now is you're really creating an application consistent backup. You are not going to miss any of those transactions that are currently in memory. How do we do this? Well, we're actually using the back-end agent, which allows us to really tie directly into the product itself and then capture everything within that server. This ties in quite nicely in what we just discussed, because we're actually storing these data bits, that in-memory database. We're storing that in an S3 repository, which then, of course, also can be an immutable backup as well. It's really the ultimate in protection. You're backing up a complete SAP HANA instance, plus the memory transactions, and all of that is stored in an immutable S3 bucket.
Yeah, and Sebastian, I think the cool thing here is as you said, you're integrating with the AWS backend agent for SAP HANA, and that's it's an SAP certified backup and restore solution for HANA workloads running on EC2. So again, AWS is providing the capability, but N2WS is providing the method. So tying those two together creates a very powerful solution for protecting your SAP HANA workloads.
Yeah, completely agree. All right. Then for data lifecycle management, that was that other thing that we talked about, having the ability to store backups in a more affordable storage tier. Not everything needs to be available in 10 seconds, and especially if you use RDS and you want to retain these backups for a very long amount of time, then we now also have the ability to archive the RDS snapshots into real true S3 buckets. So previously we introduced that feature for MySQL, but now with version 4.1, we also have the ability to archive Postgres backups as well. And as you can see right here on this slide, that is an exclusive feature. N2WS is currently the only vendor in the AWS marketplace to offer this feature. So at that point, it really becomes no longer an issue of, well, can we afford to keep the backups? It really is a question of how long do we want to keep the backups, because we do have the ability to archive the data into Amazon Glacier if you want us to.
Yeah, and this is another thing that I think is really cool, because if you think about situations where customers need to retain databases or the data within databases for a really long period of time, whether they're keeping the entire database or a point in time that's meaningful to them, or they have a need to archive an application, but they have to keep the database around for long periods of time. This provides a really cost-effective way to do that and take advantage of low-cost Amazon storage. And but the ability to kind of put it to sleep or put it in hibernation, but then also have the ability to bring it back to a running database instance is what makes this really powerful, in my opinion.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And another thing that I've seen a lot of our customers do with this feature is if they want to perform testing. So what you can do once you perform the backup, once you perform the archive of the data, you can spin up the data in a different region or in a different account altogether. So when you perform testing, you can then perform testing on production data. So you have a true representation of what the data is going to do when you deploy new features. Another new feature that we enhanced quite a lot is the VPC capturing capability. So the way I usually explain why would I want to capture VPC settings? Well, think back in the day when you had on-prem backups. What would you say if I would say I can bring back a server, but I'm not going to give you any cables, no routers, no switches, no connectivity. That server is just sitting there right there on your desk. Well, that's not going to do you much good. And that's the same thing with the VPC capturing capability. So not only are we concerned with capturing, storing, backing up, archiving the content of the resources that you have, but we also back up the network configuration as well. Previously, we captured VPC settings, subnet settings, routing tables, and security groups. And now with version 4.1, because time doesn't stand still, we also introduced a slew of new features as well, such as customer gateway, site-to-site VPN connections, transit gateway, that's the big one, transit gateway, routing tables, multicast domain, VPN gateway, NAT gateway, and VPC peering as well. This feature allows us to recreate your VPC settings in the same region and in the same account. Of course, we can also clone these configuration settings into other regions and into other accounts. And another feature you're going to see during the demo, and I'll show you how that works as well. You even have the ability to capture all of this information and allow us to turn all of that into a CloudFormation template. That is an extremely powerful feature, because what you can do with this, if you didn't start out as infrastructure as code, you can allow us to turn your infrastructure into code and then have a CloudFormation template for those configuration settings as well. So that's a really, really powerful feature, especially if you're thinking about DR situations where you want to spin up the data in a different region or in a different account. Well, just throwing the content of those resources over the fence, that's really not good enough. So this also allows you to recreate that metadata as well.
Yeah, that's really powerful, Sebastian. And I was thinking about your point where we tend to think about protecting, actual data elements, but we forget about, what I would call metadata. And in this case, in a lot of cases, metadata is data, and protecting the access to the data, or how your customers access your data, can be just as important as protecting the data itself. And I can think of a time in the past where there was a customer that had some rogue automation that removed the the pieces of the infrastructure that allowed access to the data, which created, the same type of outage as you would have if you lost the data itself. And then when it came time to try and recover that, because, those security groups weren't protected in any way, you have to figure out what was in those security groups, because you can't just provide access to everyone to get your applications back up and running. That's a security risk. So, this is very, very powerful for customers. And also, you mentioned like the migration use case, which we've seen customers take advantage of. So, very powerful stuff here from your team.
That's a very good point. I'll be honest, I didn't even think of this. I mean, it doesn't always have to be a rogue admin. It doesn't really have to be an attack. Sometimes it's, as you mentioned, rogue automation. I have come across similar situations where accounts were locked down and things were deleted by automation processes just because they weren't tagged correctly and that sort of thing. So yeah, having the ability to really back up everything that you need, that's a really powerful feature. Then another new feature that we have as far as integrations is concerned, N2WS now also supports Amazon FSx for NetApp ONTAP. And this is a really, really interesting feature as well. We added FSx support for Windows, for Lustre quite a long time ago. And it's a really, really loved feature within our product. And NetApp ONTAP is such a simple system, such a simple service to deploy, and it ties so nicely even into your on-prem resources that a lot of customers asked for the inclusion of that feature into our product as well. So this, and NetApp even has that on their website, and I love their tagline where it says, well, this isn't Vegas, it's your data. And don't hope for good odds when you're dealing with your mission critical data. So NetApp ONTAP already has some features that allow you to perform, obviously, the replication, and then also perform some backups as well. But the big advantage of N2WS supporting the Amazon FSx for NetApp ONTAP is clearly the single pane of glass, because I don't want to have several different consoles to have to manage to see all of my backups. So us being able to support this particular service now makes things a lot easier for backup administrators, because they really truly see everything in a single pane of glass and don't have to juggle several different consoles at the same time.
Yeah, and that was kind of what my point was going to be, Sebastian, is, oftentimes there's more than one way to do things in your environment, and there's a lot of benefit from, I think you mentioned earlier, orchestrated recoveries as part of the software feature set, and so being able to recover an application, including the various elements of it, the instances, the volumes, the FSx elements of it as one orchestrated recovery is very powerful, and that's a key benefit of using this with N2WS. Yeah,
I agree. And then the last one in the list is that we enhanced our UI. And things are really getting real when a vendor tells you that the UI is so much more powerful and so much better now. But all joking aside, there are some really nice new features within the product that make management of the data, the visualization of the data that you have, a lot easier. And I would say, for me personally, the persistent column sizes is something that I really enjoy within the product now. So not only can I collapse certain fields that I don't ever need or I don't need to see, I can now also choose which columns are actually being presented to me, and I can change the column sizes as well, because, well, sometimes I have data that just requires more information on screen. So this is a really nice enhancement for just the beauty of the product and the visualization of the data that I'm seeing within the console. So this is my favorite part. This is where I'm actually going to show you a live demo of the product. So what I'm going to do now is I'll switch into my live screen. So what you're seeing here on the screen, that's my my AWS Marketplace web browser. And first, let's talk about how to deploy the system. Everybody that already is familiar with N2WS, and you're already familiar with this, N2WS is a solution that you can just acquire within the AWS Marketplace. Super simple to deploy. All you have to do is you just choose which region you'd like us to spin up in. What you can see here is we are supported in all of the regions up to and including GovCloud. You just simply hit the continue button and it starts deploying within your environment within seconds. This entire deployment process doesn't take a long time. It takes about, I'd say, 30 seconds or so. Once the system is deployed, this is how you're going to be able to access it, and it works through a portal. So right now I'm logged in as a root admin user, which means I get to see and do everything, which is great for me, but of course, not really a sensible way to address your data security. That's why N2WS Backup and Recovery also supports identity provider, which means we can then use strong authentication to log into this console, tokens, smart cards, you name it, all of that is supported. The dashboard is the first thing you're always going to see. This is going to show you anything that happened within the last 24 hours as far as your backups, your disaster recovery backups, and your archiving is concerned. And it also shows you a visualization of a lot more information, such as how many backups are we actually managing for you, and how much money are we saving you using that resource control feature. Remember, automating turning off of resources when they're not needed. And then over here under the Cost Explorer, you have a running tally of how much all of the backups are actually going to cost you. The volume usage percentage, that's an interesting feature as well, because we're already touching your data to perform backups of it. So why not report on volumes that are being used on EC2 instances? So if you see some volumes, and you can set these settings as well, that are used above a certain percentage, then we can alert you to that. And if they are underutilized, then we can report on that as well, which then has the advantage that, oh, it's going to save me money because I have the ability to consolidate data as well. Creating backups of the resource is super simple. You just simply create a backup policy. As you can see, I have a bunch of them already created here. So when I go into one of my backup policies, remember earlier when I mentioned how flexible the product is? So I'm using a very conservative approach performing daily backups, but there's nothing to keep you from performing backups far more frequently. As I mentioned, if you wanted to every 60 seconds. I do have customers who are performing backups every 5, 10, 15 minutes. And then that flexibility also allows you to switch into a different interval outside business hours if you wanted to. Backup targets is where you choose what you want to back up. There's different ways of doing this, either obviously the manual way of clicking add backup targets, or you can also automate the collection of resources into backup policy simply through tagging. Now this allows you to back up instances. This will automatically include any volumes that you want. Of course, you also have the option to perform backups of only the volumes, RDS databases, Aurora clusters. This also includes Aurora Serverless, Redshift, DynamoDB, Elastic File System, FSX, all of the different flavors there are, including ONTAP now. And then S3 bucket sync allows us to automate the syncing of S3 buckets and retaining changed files as well. So it's a little bit more interesting than just simply syncing the information. Now, once these backups are being performed in the same region where the data is currently residing, you're probably wondering, well, what happens if that region goes down? And that's what the DR button is for. So this allows me to create disaster recovery backups of the data into other regions. So in my case, my data is located in Virginia, and that means I'm usually creating disaster recovery backups into Ohio because, well, nothing bad ever happens in Ohio. We all know that. But if you're saying, well, what about multiple region outage? What's going to happen if North Virginia goes down into Ohio? I mean, it could happen, right? So there's nothing to keep you from performing backups in other regions as well. And gosh, why stop there? So at this point, only an earth-ending event is going to take out my infrastructure. And I guess at that point, we have more important things to worry about than just data fidelity. Down here, I also have my cross-account disaster recovery backups, which means, well, if I lose access to an entire account, what happens? And this isn't something that has never happened before. So if you want to sleep well tonight, don't do what I'm going to tell you next. Don't type in the words code spaces into Google. Codespaces is a company which did all the right things. They even performed disaster recovery backups into other regions, but then their account got hacked and, well, that person deleted their backups and that company went out of business within 24 hours. Could have been easily avoided by just creating cross-account disaster recovery backups. It's literally a single mouse click. And again, I also have the option to create these cross-account disaster recovery backups in multiple regions as well if I want to. So this is how you perform backups, but of course the next step, you remember that a level of adoption is, well, now you guys got this figured out, but how can I save money? Now it's very simple. Here we choose how much data would you like us to retain. So these are generations of backups, and we're talking about snapshot backups. They're super fast, but as I also mentioned, not all data needs to be available within seconds. So you do have the option to just simply switch this toggle and then choose, well, how long would you like to retain the data in real true S3 buckets? This can be done by time or generations. And if you want to retain the data for a very long time, you also have the option to archive this into Glacier. Down here, you can choose, is this standard S3, infrequent access, Glacier, or deep archive Glacier? And if you choose deep archive Glacier, you might as well keep it forever, because deep archive Glacier, that's 99 cents for a terabyte a month. You do have another option here as well, which allows you to not retain snapshots at all. Yes, you heard me right. So that means we're going to create snapshots, then immediately turn around and archive them into S3 buckets and then delete the snapshots. So this is really absolute maximum savings. Another feature that's super important also is the AnySnap feature. The AnySnap feature allows us to import existing snapshots into N2WS Backup and Recovery. So if you manually created snapshots by clicking on the Create Snapshot button, or maybe at some point you had a script running, wouldn't it be great to allow us to import those snapshots into N2WS Backup and Recovery and then also archive them into S3 buckets and delete the original snaps? And that's exactly what the product can do for you. It has the ability to collect those snapshots based on different modification settings that you can set, and then we can import them and archive them into S3. That's a savings that you can realize on day one. Now, remember, I probably sound like a broken record. I mentioned that single pane of glass about 12 times at this point, and the backup monitor is that single pane of glass. It doesn't make any difference where I created these backups, which regions, which accounts, it's all going to show up right here. And I can start filtering this by accounts, by users, by policies, or the resources themselves. So if somebody would say, well, I want to see all of the Active Directory backups we have, okay, well, I can show you all of the backup sets that contain that resource as well. Now, remember, I did mention that we overhauled the UI as well. So if you're already familiar with all of this and you're saying, well, wouldn't it be great to have more screen retail storage? Well, I can do that as well. And then, of course, I can also turn on and off certain resources as well if I don't need this. And I can also set the column sizes here as well. Once you figured out what you want to restore from, all you have to do is choose the resource, click on Recover. You can restore the data into any region of your choosing. You can restore the data into any account. And if you create a disaster recovery backup of the data, you can also restore the data from that disaster recovery account. Down here, you're always going to see all of the resources that are part of this backup policy. You have 3 more options. You can recover the entire resource. You would probably do that if somebody intentionally or unintentionally deleted the entire resource. And as Mike already talked about, the The metadata is something that's important, and we are storing that as well. So it's not just the content, but we also know, well, which instance type was that, which key pair was used, what's the VPC settings, the subnet settings, the security groups, and all of that information is stored. If I just simply click on the recover instance button, it's going to do just that. It's going to recover everything. But I also have the ability to take that entire configuration and clone it into other regions and into other accounts, depending on how much data I actually lost. I also have the ability to recover specific volumes. You can override any of these configuration settings. So if you want to make the instance bigger, smaller, change the IP address, change the VPC settings, you can do that. And as I mentioned, you're never going to lose that granularity to be able to recover certain files and folders. And that's what this really powerful feature allows you to do. So when I click on this, that's going to bring up a file manager right here within the product, and I can browse through the information and recover precisely what I need. This just happens to be a Windows file server, but it makes absolutely no difference. N2WS is completely agnostic as far as if it's Linux, if it's Windows, and it doesn't even matter if the data is encrypted, because we can manage the KMS encryption keys for you on the back end. N2WS Backup and Recovery also has something we call multi-generational file and folder level recovery. That sounds really nifty, and what it does is it makes your life a lot easier. Because if somebody says, I'm missing a file and folder, I know what your question is going to be. Your question is going to be, when was the last time you had that file and folder? And I also know what the answer to that question is. The answer is, I don't know. So that means that I now have to browse through all of my backups and try to find that information. Well, that's much simpler with N2WS Backup and Recovery. See, right here, I chose to open my last 4 backups off a specific resource, and I even have a search functionality. So this means I now can search for the information that I'm after, and it's going to show me exactly which one of the backups contains that information. The really interesting part here is there is no pre-cataloging, no pre-indexing necessary for this. You can do this with any data at any point in time without having to pre-plan any of this. So file and folder level recovery is extremely powerful. And everything we talked about, well, is really a one-off. So that's why the recovery scenarios are super important. What if I need to recover everything all at once? So here, all I have to do is I just simply choose the destination region. Where should the data end up? What's the destination account? Which AWS account should the data be pumped into? And here I can then choose my resources that I'm trying to fail over. I also have the option to choose the recovery order, because sometimes certain resources want to spin up in a certain order. You can make configuration changes on any of these resources. Remember, that's that metadata that we're recording. And you can override this. So as I said, if you want to make this bigger, if you want to make it smaller, if you want to assign a different IP address to it, feel free to do that. The system has the ability to do all of that. At that point, it's really just a single mouse click. Run scenario, that's my failover scenario. In my case, that's from Virginia to Ohio into my secondary AWS account. But of course, I can schedule this as well. Remember that DR drill we talked about earlier? So I here have a scheduling capability. In my case, I created a schedule, I called it quarterly. So every 90 days, I want to create a DR drill. And once I do that, well, I want to receive a report on that, and at this point, that's completely off my plate, because the system is going to do this completely automatically. So that's what the recovery scenarios allow you to do. You don't have to take my word for it, so let me show you something real quick here. This is my DR account. That's Ohio, and as you can see, I don't have any resources running here. So what I can do is I can just simply click on Run Scenario. It's going to say, sure, which backup set would you like me to use? Well, let's use the one from last night. I'm going to click on Recover. It says, are you sure you want to do this right now in a live webinar? Sure. What's the worst that can happen? I'm going to then see right here in my console that the recovery is in progress. You don't have to take my word for it. So if we switch back to my AWS console and just do the refresh, can see that now my resources are spinning up exactly in the shape and order how I wanted them to spin up in that recovery scenario. So extremely super powerful stuff. Now, of course, there is also reporting built in as well, and the system has the ability to recover itself. Let me show you some of the ransomware features we talked about earlier. So first off, we do have the ability to secure DR account, which means you choose which permissions would you like us to scan for. Well, for show and tell, I usually use delete snapshot. I don't want anybody being able to delete my backups. And now we're not just going to scan which role we're using, which IAM user we're using in that account. No, we're actually choosing to look at all the roles and all the users. And when we find that, we're going to alert you to this, which means even a rogue admin can sneak in permissions behind your back into that account. In that same vein, we also have the immutable backups. So when I create an S3 repository, you're probably wondering, this sounds all very difficult, and how do I deploy this? Super simple. It's one single button right here. So when you create a storage repository, all you have to do is just simply make it immutable. One thing I should mention, though, if you're trying to upgrade this, you need to create a new repository. So existing repositories, when I edit them, I cannot turn on immutable backups after the fact. So going forward, you do need to recreate new S3 buckets in order to create that immutable backup. Another feature that we also included as well, which you didn't see earlier in these slides, is one of my favorites. We also included password rules. So if you're using an identity provider, this is really not going to affect you because you're probably already using strong authentication. But if you're using internal local users on the N2WS Backup and Recovery service, you now also have the ability to enforce password rules. If I want to exclude commonly used passwords, or I want the passwords to have a certain password strength, I can enforce this. And I can also enforce password expiration. So if I wanted to, gosh, every 4 weeks, I want the password to expire for my backup admins, well, I can do that as well. Again, super powerful feature here as well. The other new feature that we talked about was FSX for ONTAP for backup. Very simple. You already find this system within the backup policies. All you need to do when you choose your backup targets, all you have to do is just choose as a backup target your FSX system, and there it is. And it's just going to show up in that list as another FSX file system that you can choose to backup. Same thing goes for SAP HANA. It just works within the EC2 instances, but it will then recognize that that's an SAP HANA instance, and it will use the backend agent to perform backups of that resource as well. Remember, we did mention the VPC backups. This is something that happens as well. First, I would suggest turning on that feature. So if you have a resource, you do have the ability to turn on the feature of performing backups of the VPCs. It's just a tick box, capture VPCs, that allows us to actually dip into the accounts and perform backups of the VPC settings. And then over here under the server settings, you also have to tell us, well, how often would you, and what's the interval where you want us to look for new VPC settings? Now, in my case, I usually use every 6 hours because that's pretty convenient. So if there are some changes, I can capture them very easily. If you want to see your entire inventory of everything that we've stored, you can just choose accounts, the account itself, clone VPC entities, and this has slightly changed because obviously now there's a lot more information that we're capturing. So you can see VPC settings and also the transit gateways as well, and all of the related information to that. Sometimes, even after I explain this, people still wonder, well, is this really useful? Yes, Because if somebody says, well, I want you to restore information, I want this file server to be exactly in the state it was in on January 18th, 2021, I can say, well, I can do you one better. Because not only can I bring back the content of the resources from that day, but I can also bring back the network configuration from that day as well. This allows me now to clone this information into any region, into any AWS account. I can change the name if I wanted to. All I have to do is just click this button right here, and the entire clone process takes about 30 seconds. And if you do feel so inclined, you can even get this entire information and export it as a CloudFormation template. So that is really useful as well if you want to turn your configuration back into code and perhaps configure that as well. Last but not least is also the ability to archive the RDS snapshots. So we did talk about that earlier during the slides. Let me just show you this real quick as well. You will find that ability right here under the lifecycle management. So every time when you're thinking about how can I save money, look at the Lifecycle Management tab, because this really contains the information you're looking for. So first off, you turn on lifecycling into S3, and then if you keep scrolling down to the bottom of it, here you can also find then copy RDS snapshots to S3. And this is what you have to do to turn this on. Just simply choose a role that you want us to use. You also have the ability to change the encryption key here as well, which is super important as well. This even allows you, and this is kind of sort of a trick, I always like to point this out. If your original EC2 instances, or if your original RDS database is encrypted with a default key, well, then you can't perform cross-account disaster recovery because you can't copy those default keys. So N2WS Backup and Recovery even allows you to create DR backups of your data. Even if that data was encrypted with the default key, we do have the ability to create backups of the data and re-encrypt the data with a different key. So that's a lot of information to digest very quickly. What I'm going to do is I'll switch back to some slides where you can relax and think about where you're going to spend those $15 for Uber Eats. So this slide here is just a small selection of some of our customers. As you can see, all the important verticals are represented: space exploration, higher education, pharmaceutical, and probably most importantly, high-powered vacuums and cereal bars. And currently, N2WS Backup and Recovery is protecting more than 5,000 AWS accounts, really hundreds of thousands of protected instances. And for all of us who are a little bit older, remember when McDonald's used to have a sign, 500 million served, 1 billion served, and now it says billions and billions. That's pretty much exactly the same scenario. It started with a few thousand, and at this point, we're really at hundreds of thousands of protected instances. N2WS also protects 13 plus petabytes of backups. As a matter of fact, I think at this point it's anywhere between 15 petabytes. And if you're anything like me, you have no concept of how much a petabyte actually is. So that's why I looked up a little bit of information just to visualize that. So all the pictures on Facebook combined, that's about 2.5 petabyte. Or the Library of Congress, that's about 3 petabytes. So you can see that's an enormous amount of data that we're protecting within AWS Amazon Web Services. So now the next steps, this is really our call to action. One of the things, if you want to deploy this in your environment, you can. We do have a 30-day free trial. This offers you all of the features that I just mentioned, and you even have the ability to archive your existing snapshots using the free trial. Now, once the free trial is over, it will automatically convert into the free edition. There is no additional work, no additional configuration necessary for this. Now, we also wanted to point out that this is a really good time for you to upgrade your existing deployments of N2WS Backup and Recovery and just make use of the new features, especially use the archiving functionality. And if you do have SAP HANA instances, really start backing those up. And of course, the S3 object lock and immutable backups is an incredibly useful feature to protect you. Upgrading the instance is super simple. It really couldn't be simpler. You just simply deploy the new instance. Then during that process, it's going to ask you, do you have an existing instance? Yes, I do. And it's going to import the configuration from the existing instance into the newly deployed instance. And something else that I should probably mention as well, and I actually had a talk with Ezra a little bit earlier. So for the deployment of a new free trial of N2WS Backup and Recovery, if you deploy a free trial of N2WS, you receive $100 in AWS credits. If you're anything like me, whenever a vendor says, if you are a new customer, I'm going to give you all of this, and then you get slightly annoyed. That's why I kept pushing. And this means if you are an existing N2WS Backup and Recovery customer and you choose to upgrade to version 4.1, then you also receive a $100 voucher for AWS credits. So there's really nothing to keep you from upgrading to the newest version. It will save you money, not just in the long run, but it will save you money the moment that you upgrade as well, because of this really wonderful plan that we have in place right now.
Sebastian, that was fantastic. And there are loads and loads of questions in the Q&A and chat. So we're going to try and work through them. There's a lot about SAP, so I might ask you to talk about that a little bit more. But just as a quick closing thought, N2WS is back on the road again, and we're going to be visiting all these cities at AWS Summits. So if you're in the area of any of these cities and you would like to see us, just visit the summit. We'll be there on the show floor, and you'll see me, you'll see Sebastian at some, and other members of the N2WS team. And we really love talking about data protection and backup on AWS, along with other topics. And at these summits, we don't try and sell backup software. We try and give our customers a little break from the education that they're doing at the summits, and give away some good prizes. And I really focus N2W swag on things that everybody wants, but nobody wants to buy. So I know at reInvent, we gave away a lot of bonsai tree Lego sets, which were a very popular item. So all these summits are on the schedule. We're heading to Paris first, and we hope to see you at one of them. And if it's okay with you, Sebastian, I'd like to run through some of the questions here.
Sure, absolutely. I'm sorry I got excited and I took a little bit longer for the demo.
Oh, I think it's good. We'll make sure these get addressed either live or in a quick follow-up. So Andrew has an awesome question. He says, what can you say to the old school backend aficionados? And I think I can answer this myself. I can say, jump on in, the water's warm. This is exactly what we're doing. And what we're adding is the control plane to manage it all. Anything you would want to add on that?
I love the question. Backend aficionado, very good. Is there a magazine too, just like Cigar Aficionados? Anyway, so yeah, I completely agree with you. So the backend agent is already deployed. This isn't something that you have to do, and we basically just use that and utilize this. So the advantage here is, again, sounding like a broken record, N2WS allows you to create that single pane of glass. So if you're already familiar with the backend agent, there's nothing new to learn. It just simply uses the existing infrastructure, and then we visualize the entire backup process for you.
Awesome. So Will is asking a question that we get a lot, and we actually have some documentation on, and that's it's also an excellent question. So won't the new S3 backup capability significantly increase my storage cost?
No, not at all. So it doesn't increase your storage costs. So what happens is we create an archive of the data into S3. Truth be told, there is the initial archive into S3. That's going to be a full backup. That's true. So you do create an additional backup into S3. Trick here is if I actually have some customers who are utilizing the archive capability as a DR capability. There's nothing to keep you from saying, well, instead of keeping 2 live backups of snapshots, I'm going to keep 1 backup of snapshots, and the other, my archive, also equals my DR backup. So that already takes care of that additional storage cost. But what you have to keep in mind is once you transfer this data into real, true S3 buckets, the storage cost is incredibly small. So, for example, a snapshot in East 1 is going to cost you 5 cents per gig. Well, to store the same amount of data in an S3 bucket in standard S3, that's less than half the cost. And if you choose S3 infrequent access, that's a 75% savings. If you store the data in Glacier, that's a 93% savings. And if I choose to store it in Deep Archive Glacier, that's a 98% savings. So effectively, you're just paying 2% of what you normally would pay for a snapshot. So the longer you keep the data, the more you save.
Yeah, and actually, just to add to that, it's all about the retention, right? So if you're just keeping data for 7 days or a short interval, it's probably not worth it to move it into S3. Is that correct? Or
absolutely, I completely agree. It doesn't make a lot of sense to move the data into S3 if you're just keeping it for a few days. And generally, that break-even day where I say, yeah, moving the data into S3 does make sense is about 30 days. A lot of times, and this is actually interesting as well, a lot of times I encounter customers where I say, how long do you keep the data? Oh, 30 days. Oh, okay, so that's really the break-even date. But something you have to keep in mind is once you move the data into much cheaper storage, a lot of people say they only want to keep the data for X amount of time. And I mentioned this kind of sort of in passing earlier. Once you realize how affordable the S3 storage is, it probably makes sense to keep the data for 60 days or 90 days, because at that point, we're just talking pennies on the dollar. You can keep the same amount of data for an additional 3 months for pennies on the dollar. So it might make sense to actually revisit your retention times based on, well, where can we store the data in a much more affordable manner?
Yeah, especially if you have the mechanism to move it to the appropriate storage tier. But just to we do have some validation work we did with ESG on our website that just goes through some of the details behind this, including a little calculator that you can use to kind of estimate where your break-even point is based on your retention and data usage. So I'd be happy to point that out to you. There's a whole bunch of questions about SAP HANA. I'm not sure if we can address all of these, but I'm going to try and run through them. So are there any issues with the number of log backups that HANA runs that day and night?
No, that's not a problem at all. Because as we said, what we're using is we're using the back-end agent. So we didn't go out and reinvent the wheel here. So we're actually using the original back-end agent to access the backups and perform the backups. So that isn't an issue at all.
So Neil is asking about KMS keys. You went through this a little, and he's mentioning that it's a pain point with this current vendor that he's using to back up SAP HANA. Do you have any details about how we handle KMS keys and how they're managed?
So that's why I mentioned it, because it is a real pain point. Some of this is a feature that we implemented for a rather large customer who shall remain nameless at this point. They used encryption because, well, everybody says encrypt everything, but they made the mistake of just accessing the default encryption. So N2WS within the product has the ability to choose, well, which key would you like us to use when we perform backups of encrypted data? The really important thing to mention, this is even why the US government has no trouble using us as a backup vendor, is that the data doesn't get filtered through our product. So we're using cloud native methods of accessing the data. Essentially, we're telling AWS, do this with the data and take the encrypted data and put it there and then re-encrypt it with this data. So the data never actually flows through our solution. We don't see your data. We don't see the data in an unencrypted format, but we do have the ability to choose other encryption keys in order to keep the data encrypted. And there's two methods of doing this within the product. There is a drop down within the security features where you can choose which key would you like us to use. And you can even go extremely super flexible. So remember when I mentioned earlier that you have the ability to create disaster recovery backups in multiple regions? You do have the ability to use a different key in each region. They even have customers who have an AWS account. They use it like an HSM, like a hardware security module. That account does nothing other than create encryption keys. And then our product has the ability to dip into these keys in an account and then encrypt everything else in another account altogether. So it's super flexible and super secure.
That's awesome. When we're talking about cross-region disaster recovery of SAP HANA, what does the recovery look like? I know like there's other products that offer high availability scenarios where you're running kind of two workloads in two regions. Can you just talk very briefly about how N2W differs in that way?
So that's an interesting thing. I mean, N2WS Backup and Recovery itself, that's another question I get quite often is, oh, well, what happens if your environment fails? Because we did talk about its infrastructure as service. So N2WS itself is a resource that's running in your environment. Well, what happens if that region fails? Just like SAP HANA, what happens if that resource fails? So first off, N2WS Backup and Recovery has the ability to perform backups of itself as often as you want, every 60 seconds if you wanted to. Within the AWS Marketplace, all you would do at that point is just choose your account, your DR account, your DR region, spin up a brand new blank version of N2WS Backup and Recovery in your target account, in your target region. As I mentioned, that process takes about 30 seconds. Once the system is spun up, it's going to ask questions. It'll ask, are you spinning up a brand new version or are you performing a DR? If they say no, it's a DR, it'll find that information that we backed up of itself into your target DR region or account and import that. That takes about 60 seconds. So after about 90 seconds, you can perform a complete failover of the system. And these recovery scenarios that I mentioned, the orchestration of performing a recovery of instances, resources, FSX, file systems, you name it, all of that can be done. And the same thing works for my SAP HANA at that point. I have the ability then to spin up a brand new version or import the information into an existing system. So if you really wanted to, you do have the ability to spin one up and then recover the data into it. That's one option. It'll shave some time off, but you don't have to. You can also allow us to just simply recreate the entire environment, and that will make sure that it's a real, true representation of everything that we backed up. It's essentially a clone because we are recreating the data from the backed up data.
So I think maybe the short answer is that the recovery time objective that you're looking for, which is a key backup word, is with N2W, just storing snapshots in other regions, doing orchestration is really, really quick, and maybe not much of a difference between running two locations at the same time.
I would agree. Ultimately, really the time advantage that you have if you already have a hot running is so small that it's probably better just simply to recreate the environment, because you're not saving, we're not talking hours here, we're really just talking moments in time that you're going to save, and the storage cost and the runtime cost will definitely make up for that altogether.
Awesome. So one about object lock, and we saw this in the demo when the engineering team was showing us 4.1, and it was actually really cool to see. So if an object is locked, like a snapshot is or a backup is protected by object lock, can it be attacked? Like what happens if I go and try and delete it?
It's like the weirdest thing ever, and I think this is a feature that AWS put in. I mean, I can't really take credit for this. So when you make an S3 bucket immutable, what's going to happen is you can access the data, you can attempt to delete the data, and it will look like you're successful. So I think the reason why this is so that I can trap somebody as they're doing it. But as I mentioned, it will look like you're deleting the data. The data doesn't actually get deleted. So what happens is N2WS will say, oh, somebody attempted to delete the data, but don't worry about it. Because the moment that we access that, in quotes, deleted data, it immediately reappears. So the data never ever gets lost. It's a really interesting feature. I mean, it's almost like magic. When you see the data just simply reappear because you have an object lock, this immutable backup turned on for an S3 bucket, and the time hasn't run out on this immutable window that you created, and it just recreates the data.
Awesome. Can you go back to the previous slide just so people can see the ways to get their hands on the credits and the other information real quick?
Sure, absolutely. There you go.
Awesome. Awesome. That's how you find us on Marketplace. And if you want to get started with that free trial promo, but if you just install on Marketplace and reach out to us, we're happy to provide those infrastructure credits to support whatever POC you're going to go through on the product. And if you have credits left over, you can host a kitty cat website for about a few years, right? Couple of more questions here. By the way, a lot of compliments to both you and Mike. You guys did a fantastic job, so thank you. How about Oracle running on RDS? Is there an archive to S3 capability in 4.1?
So we don't have that capability, and that's something that AWS doesn't provide yet. So keep in mind, and this is the reason why Mike has joined us, because AWS and N2WS were partners. So every time when AWS has a new feature, then we usually deploy that as well. So right now we do have the ability to use MySQL expert and also Postgres expert. And once the other features are being added, then you're going to see them in N2WS as well.
Awesome. I'm not sure about this question, but I'm going to ask it. It says, could the instance schedule be integrated with AWS tags automatically, or do we have to create a policy explicitly to set start and stop times? So I think it's asking about adding instances to a backup, but I'm not 100% sure.
Oh, not a problem. So what I'm going to do is I'll literally show you this live. So I'll just switch to my screen. The resource control, this allows you to choose when would you like to turn something off. So here in my case, I created something called all non-essentials, and you choose what you want to turn off. You can, once again, either do this with this button. You choose the schedule. When would you like us to turn something off, and when would you like it to be turned on? But this can also be done through tagging. So as you can see, we have a custom tag called CPM resource control. And that the value of that tag is just the resource control group that you create within the product. So when you spin up an instance, the moment you spin up that instance, through tagging, it can get backed up, but through tagging, it can also be turned off when you don't need it. So, and there's a really interesting success story to this Get, which is Uber's largest competitor in Europe. They deployed N2WS Backup and Recovery, really liked the resource control feature, immediately started using it, and within the first year, they saved over $100,000 just simply turning off resources when they're not needed. Think of it as a light switch. Remember when your parents said, turn off the light when it's not needed? Well, seems like there is actually some truth to this.
You know, I love your light switch example because we also have the ability to just click the button and turn instances on and off in groups. And I think the best way to save on power is to put light switches in accessible locations, right? So like if the light switch is hidden deep inside some kind of cave, it's going to be hard to, you know, remind people to turn the lights on and off. So that's an awesome example.
I actually I have some customers who use this, and I'm always really surprised, happy how our customers make use of the features that we provide in ways we didn't think of it. So I had a customer who wanted their database admins to be able to turn RDS instances on, off, mostly development instances, but they didn't want to give them access to the AWS console. So what they did do is they gave them access to the N2WS Backup and Recovery console, which means they have absolutely no access to the resource themselves, but they do have access to the on and off button from within our product. You can do the same thing with the backup policies as well. So theoretically, what I could do is I could say, well, this database admin, they're going to work over the weekend, and when they're performing development work, do I really want them bothering me when they need to perform a recovery of something that they did wrong? Well, you could create internal users within N2WS, lock them down however you want, and they only have access to the resources I give them access to, and they have the ability to recover those. So there's some really crafty things you can do with our console.
I love the example of the non-AWS console users being able to turn the lights on and off. So that's a great use case right there. If you're interested in seeing more specific details of anything we covered today, we're very happy to do additional demos and get into discussions with you on how you might implement N2WS Backup and Recovery, or if you're a customer, how you might take advantage of some of these new breakout features in version 4.1. And just a reminder, customers, non-customers, if you deploy N2WS version 4.1, or upgrade to 4.1, we're happy to provide some infrastructure credits, and we would love a discussion with you about how you're using N2W and you know, see if there's areas that we can better support you meeting your organizational objectives. So have a great rest of your day, and we'll be in touch soon.